Welcome back to Twisted Tales, the channel where we delve into the darkest corners of human nature. The story you're about to hear is a chilling reminder that monsters often wear the most respectable masks. It's a tale of healing hands that hide a horrifying secret, of a brilliant mind twisted by greed and a disregard for human life. We're about to unravel a criminal investigation that sent shockwaves through the medical community and shattered the trust of an entire city. Before we plunge into the shadows, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss a single one of our shocking stories. Now, settle in and prepare to meet the doctor who ran a syndicate of death. The city of Veritas knew Dr. Alistair Vance as a savior. His hands, steady and precise, had snatched countless lives from the brink of death. The Vance Institute for Transplant Surgery, a gleaming monument of glass and steel that pierced the city's skyline, was his temple, and within its hallowed halls, he was a god. His reputation was as pristine as the starched white coat he wore, a tapestry woven with threads of medical genius, philanthropic endeavors, and a disarming, grandfatherly charm that could soothe the most terrified patient. To the public, he was a beacon of hope. To his colleagues, a paragon of surgical excellence. And to the desperate souls on the transplant waiting list, he was their last, best chance. But beneath the polished veneer of the celebrated surgeon, a darkness festered, a rot that spread its tendrils deep into the very foundations of his gilded empire. It was a secret known only to a select few, a cabal bound by greed and a chilling disregard for the sanctity of human life. For every life Dr. Vance publicly saved, another was silently, ruthlessly extinguished in the shadows. His success was built not just on skill and innovation, but on a clandestine network that preyed on the city's most vulnerable, a macabre supply chain that dealt not in medicine, but in human flesh. The first tremor in this carefully constructed facade came not from a disgruntled employee or a suspicious colleague, but from a young, hungry investigative journalist named Sarah Jenkins. Sarah was a study in contrasts to the world she was about to infiltrate. While Dr. Vance moved through a world of sterile operating theaters and adoring accolades, Sarah's domain was the city's gritty underbelly. She thrived on lukewarm coffee, the incessant hum of the police scanner, and the thrill of chasing a story that others were too afraid or too complacent to pursue. Her desk at the Veritas Chronicle was a chaotic collage of case files, cryptic notes, and the ghosts of stories past. Her journey into the heart of Vance's darkness began with a seemingly unrelated string of missing person cases. They were the forgotten faces of Veritas. A runaway teenager from a group home, a homeless man who frequented the downtown shelters, a young immigrant working off the books to send money back to her family. To the overburdened Veritas Police Department, they were disparate, tragic footnotes in the daily chronicle of urban life. But to Sarah, who had a knack for seeing patterns where others saw only chaos, they were a thread. A faint, almost invisible thread, but one that she couldn't resist pulling. Her investigation started in the usual way, poring over police reports, interviewing grieving families and apathetic social workers, and spending countless hours in the city's grimier corners, trying to piece together the last known movements of the vanished. The thread led her to a free health clinic in a rundown part of the city, a clinic that offered basic medical care to the uninsured and the undocumented. It was a noble endeavor on the surface, a lifeline for those who had fallen through the cracks. But as she dug deeper, she found a strange connection. The clinic was funded by a series of charitable foundations, all of which, after a labyrinthine journey through shell corporations and anonymous donors, traced back to one source, the Vance Institute. It was a tenuous link, one that her editor, a grizzled veteran named Frank Miller, dismissed as circumstantial. A rich doctor doing some charity work? Hardly a headline, Jenkins, he'd grumbled, his voice thick with the smoke of 1,000 cigarettes. You're chasing shadows. But Sarah's instincts screamed otherwise. Why the secrecy? Why the convoluted financial trail to fund a simple clinic? It felt less like charity and more like a carefully concealed operation. Her suspicions solidified when she spoke to a former nurse from the clinic, a woman named Maria, whose conscience had finally outweighed her fear. They met in a dimly lit diner, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee and regret. Maria's hands trembled as she recounted her time at the clinic. She spoke of a private backroom, strictly off-limits to most staff, where a different kind of medicine was practiced. She described late-night visits from an unmarked van, and special patients who were brought in, often disoriented and unwell, and then whisked away just as mysteriously. Most disturbingly, she spoke of the meticulous medical workups performed on these individuals, workups that seemed far too comprehensive for a simple checkup. They were testing for blood type, tissue compatibility, and overall organ health. They weren't treating illnesses. They were cataloging assets. Maria had never seen Dr. Vance at the clinic, but his name was whispered in the hallways, a phantom benefactor whose generosity came with unspoken conditions. The man who ran the clinic, a stoic and intimidating figure known only as the caretaker, made it clear that questions were not welcome. Maria had been fired after she'd stumbled upon a patient's file that had been accidentally left out. It contained not only a detailed medical history, but also a series of numbers and a single word, viable. The next day, both the file and the patient were gone. Armed with Maria's testimony, Sarah felt the ground shift beneath her. This was no longer just a story about missing people. It was about something far more sinister. She began to focus her investigation on the Vance Institute itself. She spent weeks observing the hospital, tracking the movements of its staff, and trying to find a way inside. She discovered that the institute had a private wing, a state-of-the-art facility that was even more exclusive than the rest of the hospital. It was reserved for a select clientele, wealthy international patients who flew in on private jets and paid exorbitant sums for expedited transplants. The official line was that these organs came from a legitimate international donor exchange program. But Sarah knew that such programs were notoriously slow and fraught with bureaucracy. The speed and efficiency with which the Vance Institute procured organs for its wealthy clients was not just remarkable. It was statistically impossible. She needed to get closer to see what happened behind the polished doors of that private wing. The opportunity came in the form of a disgruntled former employee, a medical records clerk named David, whom she tracked down through a source in the hospital's IT department. David had been fired for insubordination, which, as he bitterly explained to Sarah over a beer, was code for asking too many questions. He told her about the Institute's dual record-keeping system, a pristine, official set of records for the auditors and the public, and a second, encrypted system known as the ledger. He had only caught glimpses of it, but he knew it was where the real business of the Institute was conducted. The ledger contained the true financial transactions, the real patient histories, and, he suspected, the origins of the organs that appeared as if by magic. David, fueled by a desire for revenge and a hefty sum of cash from Sarah's meager freelance budget, agreed to help. He gave her his old security badge and a uniform, and a crash course on how to navigate the hospital's labyrinthine corridors without arousing suspicion. His final piece of advice was a chilling one. Don't get noticed by Dr. Vance. The man sees everything. He's got this way of looking at you like he's not just seeing you, but he's seeing right through you, weighing and measuring every part of you. The night Sarah entered the Vance Institute as a temporary janitor was the night she crossed a threshold from which there was no return. The hospital at night was a different entity, a place of hushed whispers and long, sterile shadows. The gleaming facade of the day gave way to an eerie silence, broken only by the rhythmic beeping of machines and the soft squeak of her rubber-soled shoes on the polished linoleum. Her heart hammered against her ribs with a force that felt loud enough to echo through the empty hallways. Every doctor, every nurse she passed was a potential threat, every locked door a tantalizing secret. Following David's instructions, she made her way to the records room in the sub-basement, a cold, climate-controlled vault that housed the hospital's digital and physical archives. The official records were all there, neatly filed and easily accessible. But she was looking for the ledger. David had told her it was on a separate server, air-gapped from the main network, accessible only from a specific terminal in a locked office within the records room. An office that belonged to the hospital's chief administrator, a woman named Eleanor Vance, the doctor's formidable and fiercely loyal sister. As she picked the lock on Eleanor's office, a skill she'd learned for a story on a reformed cat burglar, her hands were slick with sweat. Inside, The office was as immaculate and severe as the woman who occupied it. A single, high-end computer sat on a large mahogany desk. It was the terminal David had described. She took a deep breath and inserted a flash drive containing a sophisticated hacking program he had provided. The seconds stretched into an eternity as the program worked to bypass the layers of security. Finally, with a soft click, a new icon appeared on the screen. A simple, unadorned black square. The ledger. She opened it, and the breath caught in her throat. It was a macabre accounting of human lives. Each entry was a name, a date, and a series of codes. Some were marked donor, others recipient. The donors were a ghost-like roster of the cities forgotten, their names matching the missing persons reports she had been tracking. Their medical profiles were detailed, their organs catalogued like items in a warehouse inventory. The recipients were a who's who of the global elite, their names synonymous with wealth and power. And then there were the financial records, a staggering flow of money through offshore accounts and untraceable cryptocurrency, sums that could buy and sell human lives with terrifying ease. But it was the final column in the ledger that made her blood run cold. It was titled Acquisition, and next to each donor was a single word. Some were marked voluntary, a term she knew was a cruel euphemism, but many others were marked involuntary. And next to some of those, a final, chilling note: termination. This wasn't just organ trafficking. This was murder for hire, a sophisticated, industrialized system of slaughter, orchestrated by the man the city revered as a saint. She frantically copied the files onto her encrypted hard drive, her mind racing. She had it. The proof. The story that would not just make her career, but would tear down an empire. As the last file copied, she heard a sound in the hallway. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and getting closer. Panic seized her. She ripped the flash drive from the computer, shoved it in her pocket, and scrambled to cover her tracks, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She slipped out of the office just as the footsteps reached the end of the hall, melting back into the shadows of the sub-basement. As she made her way back through the sleeping hospital, her janitor's cart her only camouflage, she felt a change in the atmosphere. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was predatory. The shadows no longer seemed empty. They seemed to watch her. She risked a glance up at a security camera and felt a jolt of pure terror. It was slowly panning, not in its usual automated sweep, but as if it were being manually operated, following her. She quickened her pace, her disguise suddenly feeling flimsy and transparent. As she rounded a corner, she came face to face with him. Dr. Alistair Vance. He was standing in the middle of the hallway, his hands clasped behind his back, his familiar, kindly face illuminated by the soft glow of a nearby nurse's station. He wasn't in his scrubs, but a tailored suit that seemed out of place in the sterile environment. He looked at her, and the smile on his face, the one that had graced 100 magazine covers and reassured 1,000 patients, did not reach his eyes. They were cold, analytical, and held a glint of something she had only ever seen in the eyes of predators. "You've been a busy bee tonight," he said, his voice a soft, almost paternal purr that sent a shiver down her spine. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. He knew. Somehow he knew. Sarah's blood turned to ice. She was trapped in the belly of the beast, and the beast was awake and looking right at her. The story was no longer something she was chasing. It was chasing her. And in the chilling silence of the Vance Institute, under the watchful, predatory gaze of its creator, she realized that her investigation had just become a fight for her own survival. The seconds stretched into an eternity as Sarah stood frozen under Dr. Vance's unervingly calm gaze. His smile was a mask, a placid surface on a deep, dark lake, and she could feel the cold currents of what lay beneath. The janitor's uniform, her shield of anonymity, felt as thin as paper. He had called her a busy bee, a seemingly innocuous phrase that was laced with the deadliest of threats. He knew. The security breach, the copied file, she knew everything. "It's late for cleaning this wing, isn't it?" he continued, his voice maintaining its gentle, conversational tone. He took a step closer, his expensive leather shoes making no sound on the polished floor. We value thoroughness here at the Institute. It's the small details, you see, that separate the mediocre from the masters. A principle I apply to all my endeavors. Every word was a carefully chosen dart, aimed to instill fear and paralysis. Sarah's mind, usually a whirlwind of questions and connections, was a blank slate of pure terror. Her escape routes, once meticulously planned, now seemed like foolish fantasies. The man before her didn't just run a hospital. He controlled it, every camera, every lock, every shadow. I was just finishing my rounds, she stammered, her voice a reedy whisper she barely recognized as her own. She clutched the handle of her janitor's cart, the cold plastic a flimsy anchor in a sea of dread. Vance's smile widened, but it was a predator's smile, all teeth and no warmth. Of course you were a diligent worker. I do admire diligence. He gestured down the hallway with a graceful, almost surgical flick of his wrist. Go on then. Finish your rounds. We wouldn't want to keep you from your duties. It was a dismissal, but it felt like a death sentence. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that he was letting her go for a reason. He was a cat and she was the mouse, and the game had just begun. With a jerky nod, Sarah pushed the cart past him, her back tingling with the imagined sensation of his eyes boring into her. She didn't dare look back. Every footstep echoed in the cavernous silence, a drumbeat counting down to some unknown, terrible fate. She made it out of the hospital, her body moving on pure adrenaline. The cool night air hit her like a physical blow, and she gasped, her lungs burning. She didn't stop until she was several blocks away, huddled in a darkened doorway, her body racked with tremors. He had let her go. Why? It was a question that screamed in her mind. He could have had her detained, captured, silenced within the walls of his fortress. But he hadn't. He had let her walk out with the evidence that could destroy him. It wasn't mercy. It was a statement of power. He was telling her that it didn't matter what she had. He was untouchable. Her first instinct was to go to the police. But who would believe her? An obsessive journalist with a wild story about the city's most beloved citizen, backed by evidence from a stolen, encrypted file that could easily be dismissed as a fabrication. Vance would have the best lawyers money could buy, a legion of powerful friends, and a public image that was virtually unassailable. She would be crushed, discredited, and then she would disappear, another name on a list of inconvenient people. No, she had to be smarter than that. She needed more. She needed irrefutable proof, something that couldn't be explained away by clever lawyers. She needed a witness. She needed to find someone on the inside who was willing to talk, someone who could corroborate the data in the ledger. Her thoughts immediately went to David, the disgruntled records clerk. But when she called his number, it went straight to a disconnected tone. A cold knot of dread tightened in her stomach. She went to his last known address, a rundown apartment building on the city's east side. The door was ajar. With a sense of foreboding, she pushed it open. The small apartment had been ransacked. Furniture was overturned, drawers were pulled out, and papers were strewn across the floor. David was nowhere to be seen. On the wall, scrawled in what looked like ketchup, were two words, "Busy Bee." The message was clear. They had gotten to David. They were watching her. Vance wasn't just a surgeon. He was the head of a syndicate, and he had eyes and ears everywhere. The city, once her playground, now felt like a cage. Sarah went underground. She abandoned her apartment, ditched her phone, and started using burner phones and encrypted communication. She moved between cheap, anonymous motels, paying in cash and never staying in one place for more than a night. Her life became a paranoid existence of looking over her shoulder, of seeing a threat in every shadow, of trusting no one. Her only contact with the outside world was Frank, her editor. They met in secret, in places where they were unlikely to be seen. A deserted park at dawn, a noisy food court in a suburban mall, the back pew of a church during a weekday service. At first, Frank was skeptical, his journalistic cynicism warring with the raw fear in Sarah's eyes. But when she showed him the contents of the hard drive, his skepticism evaporated, replaced by a horrified awe. The names, the dates, the financial transactions, it was all there, a meticulous record of an empire built on murder. "This is monstrous," he'd whispered, his face pale in the glow of the laptop screen. "This is the kind of story that gets people killed, Sarah." "They already have," she'd replied, her voice flat. "They got to David. I'm next if I don't expose them first." Together, they began to piece together the puzzle. Frank used his old contacts, his deep well of sources built over decades of reporting, to discreetly look into the names of the wealthy recipients in the ledger. He uncovered a pattern of sudden, miraculous recoveries from terminal illnesses, of patients who had been at death's door one day and were back on their yachts the next, their health restored by a last-minute organ transplant at the prestigious Vance Institute. Meanwhile, Sarah focused on the victims. She went back to the free clinic not as a journalist but as a ghost. She staked it out for days, watching the comings and goings, her camera with its long-range lens her only companion. She saw the unmarked van Maria had described, and she saw the caretaker, a hulking, silent man with dead eyes, who moved with the brutal efficiency of a predator. She followed him, a dangerous game of cat and mouse through the city's grimy arteries. He led her to a network of flophouses and homeless shelters, places where desperate people could be easily lured away with the promise of a hot meal and a warm bed. Her breakthrough came when she managed to plant a tiny GPS tracker on the van. The tracker led her not to the Vance Institute, but to a secluded warehouse in the city's industrial district. The building was old and derelict, its windows boarded up, its chain-link fence topped with razor wire. It looked abandoned, but Sarah's instincts told her otherwise. For 2 days, she watched the warehouse from a derelict building across the street, surviving on protein bars and lukewarm water. She saw the van arrive in the dead of night. She saw the caretaker and his men unload human cargo, drugged, disoriented individuals who matched the descriptions of the city's missing. And she saw something that made her stomach churn. A refrigerated truck, the kind used for transporting medical supplies, leaving the warehouse in the pre-dawn hours, its destination almost certainly the Vance Institute. This was the missing link. The clinic was the recruitment center, the warehouse was the holding pen and a makeshift operating theater, and the institute was the final marketplace. She had the entire supply chain, but she still needed a human source. Her chance came in the form of a young doctor at the institute, Dr. Ben Carter. Frank had discovered that Carter had recently been put on administrative leave for emotional instability. Digging deeper, Frank found that Carter had been a rising star, one of Vance's protégés, until he had a breakdown during a late-night surgery. The official story was that he'd succumbed to the pressure. Frank suspected there was more to it. Sarah knew that approaching Carter was a huge risk. He could be a loyalist, a pawn in Vance's game. But he was also her only hope. She found him in a dive bar on the edge of town, a man trying to drown his demons in a bottle of cheap whiskey. He looked like a ghost, his face gaunt, his eyes haunted. She sat down opposite him, her heart pounding. "Dr. Carter," she said, her voice low and even, "I know what happened at the institute, and I think you do too." He looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and defiance. "I don't know what you're talking about," he slurred. "I'm talking about the patient you lost on the table 2 weeks ago," she pressed, her voice gentle but firm. "The one whose heart you were supposed to be transplanting. The one whose record said he was brain dead from a car accident. But he wasn't, was he, doctor? He was alive. You saw it in his eyes." Carter's glass slipped from his hand and shattered on the floor. The color drained from his face. He stared at her, his mouth opening and closing, but no words came out. He had been the surgeon on call that night, a last-minute replacement. He was supposed to be performing a routine organ harvesting from a brain-dead donor. But when he made the first incision, the donor had flinched. A reflex, the nurses had said. But Carter had seen the flicker of consciousness, the silent scream in the man's eyes before the anesthesiologist had quickly administered another, fatal dose. He had been haunted by it ever since, the memory playing on a loop in his mind. He had tried to raise his concerns, but he had been shut down, sedated, and placed on leave. His career was ruined, his reputation in tatters. He was a broken man. Over the next few hours, in that grimy, smoke-filled bar, the whole story came pouring out of him. He told her about the private wing, about the special donors who were brought in through a private entrance, their identities shrouded in secrecy. He spoke of Vance's godlike authority, of the unquestioning loyalty he commanded from his staff, a loyalty born of fear and greed. He confirmed the existence of the ledger, which he knew as the Book of Saints, a twisted name for a registry of death. He was terrified, but in Sarah's presence, he found a glimmer of hope, a chance for redemption. He agreed to testify, to give her the inside account she so desperately needed. But Vance's reach was long. The day after she met with Carter, Sarah returned to her motel room to find the door unlocked. Nothing was out of place, but on the pillow of her unmade bed was a single, pristine white rose, the same kind that Dr. Vance famously wore in the lapel of his suit jacket. There was no note, but the message was as clear as a gunshot in the night. I know where you are. I can get to you anytime I want. The psychological warfare was escalating. She was being hunted, not by thugs in a dark alley, but by a phantom who moved through the city's corridors of power with impunity. The fear was a constant, gnawing presence, a cold coil in the pit of her stomach. But it was also a fuel. It sharpened her senses, hardened her resolve. She wasn't just a journalist anymore. She was a survivor. She moved Carter to a secure location, a safe house that Frank had arranged through an old friend, a retired cop who still had some integrity. With Carter's testimony and the evidence from the hard drive, she finally had enough to go to the authorities. But she couldn't go to the Veritas PD. Vance owned the city, and that included its police force. She needed someone on the outside, someone with the authority to launch a federal investigation. Frank made a call to a contact at the FBI, a seasoned agent in the organized crime division named Agent Miller, no relation to Frank. A man with a reputation for being relentless and incorruptible. A meeting was set. As Sarah prepared to meet with Miller, she knew she was at a crossroads. She had the story, the evidence, the witness. She had everything she needed to bring down a monster. But she also knew that by stepping out of the shadows and into the light, she was painting a target on her own back. Vance would not go down without a fight. He would use all of his power, all of his resources to silence her. The final chapter of this story was yet to be written, and she had a terrifying feeling that it would be written in blood. The meeting with Agent Miller took place in a sterile, featureless room in a federal building, a place that felt a million miles away from the grimy alleys and shadowy corners where Sarah had been living. Miller was a stark contrast to the city cops she was used to. He was sharp, focused, and his eyes missed nothing. He listened intently as Sarah laid out the entire story, from the first missing person report to the horrors of the ledger, his expression a mask of professional neutrality. Frank sat beside her, a silent, supportive presence, while Dr. Carter, pale and nervous, recounted his story via a secure video link from the safe house. When she was finished, she pushed the encrypted hard drive across the table. "It's all in there," she said, her voice hoarse. "The names, the money, the murders. It's all there." Miller picked up the drive, weighing it in his hand as if it were the heart of the city's darkness. For a long moment he was silent. Then he looked at her, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something beyond professional detachment in his eyes. It was a cold, hard anger. "If what you're telling me is true, Ms. Jenkins," he said, his voice a low growl, "then you've just uncovered one of the most monstrous criminal enterprises I've ever encountered. You've shown incredible courage." He paused, his gaze hardening. "And you've put yourself in incredible danger." The weeks that followed were a blur of clandestine meetings, debriefings, and strategy sessions. The FBI took over, moving with a speed and efficiency that was both terrifying and exhilarating. Sarah and Frank were placed under protective custody, moved to a secure federal facility. The sense of being hunted was replaced by the suffocating embrace of federal protection. It was a gilded cage, but a cage nonetheless. For the first time in months, Sarah could sleep without one eye open, but she felt a profound sense of powerlessness. The story was no longer hers. It belonged to the federal justice system. Agent Miller's team worked in the shadows, using the information from the ledger to build their case. They corroborated the financial data, tracing the flow of money through the labyrinth of offshore accounts. They discreetly interviewed the families of the victims, piecing together the last days of their lives. They placed the warehouse under 24-hour surveillance, gathering irrefutable video evidence of the syndicate's operations. The plan was for a coordinated raid, a swift, decisive strike that would decapitate the entire organization in one fell swoop. The targets were the warehouse, the free clinic, and the private wing of the Vance Institute. The linchpin of the operation was Dr. Carter. He had agreed to wear a wire, to engage Vance in a conversation that would, they hoped, elicit a confession. It was an incredibly risky move, but it was their best chance to get Vance himself on tape, to forge a direct, undeniable link between the celebrated surgeon and the mountain of evidence they had compiled. The night of the sting was thick with tension. Sarah sat with Frank and Agent Miller in a mobile command center parked a few blocks from the Vance Institute, the van bristling with antennas and surveillance equipment. She watched on a bank of monitors as the tactical teams moved into position, ghosts in the city's night. She could hear the strained breathing of Dr. Carter through the live audio feed, a sound that mirrored the frantic beating of her own heart. Carter, looking haggard but resolute, walked into Vance's opulent office at the Institute. Vance was there as expected, reviewing some files. He looked up as Carter entered, his face a mask of feigned concern. "Ben," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "I'm glad you came. I've been worried about you. We need to talk about getting you back to work." "I'm not here to talk about my job, Alistair," Carter said, his voice trembling slightly. "I'm here to talk about the man on my table 2 weeks ago, the one who wasn't brain dead." Vance's demeanor changed in an instant. The mask of concern fell away, revealing the cold, reptilian predator beneath. "You're overwrought, Ben. The pressure got to you. You need rest." "Don't patronize me," Carter snapped, his voice gaining strength. "I know what I saw, and I know about the others. I know about the ledger." Vance was silent for a moment. He rose from his desk and walked to the window, his back to Carter. He looked out at the glittering lights of the city he owned. "You were always a sentimentalist, Ben. A fine technician, but you lacked the vision, the will to make the difficult choices for the greater good." "The greater good?" Carter's voice was incredulous. "You're murdering people for profit." "I am saving lives," Vance hissed, spinning around, his face contorted in a snarl of self-righteous fury. "The lives that matter, the great men, the innovators, the leaders who shape the world. And I take from those who have nothing, who contribute nothing, who are nothing but a drain on society." It's a simple, elegant equation, a balancing of the scales. It was the confession they needed. In the command van, Miller gave the signal. "Go, go, go." On the monitors, Sarah watched as the FBI teams stormed the 3 locations simultaneously. At the warehouse, they found a scene from a nightmare. A makeshift operating theater, holding cells with terrified, drugged individuals, and coolers packed with human organs, ready for transport. The caretaker and his men were taken down in a swift, brutal raid. At the clinic, they arrested the staff who were complicit in the recruitment of victims. And at the Institute, the tactical team burst into Vance's office. The look of stunned, arrogant disbelief on his face, as he was thrown against the wall and handcuffed, was a sight that Sarah would never forget. The god had been cast out of his temple. The aftermath was a media firestorm. The story of the Butcher of Veritas was on every news channel, every newspaper front page. The city was in shock, its trust in its institutions shattered. The wealthy and powerful who had been the beneficiaries of Vance's syndicate were exposed, their reputations destroyed. The Vance Institute was shut down, its gleaming facade now a monument to a horrifying deception. The trial was a spectacle. Vance, stripped of his tailored suits and his aura of invincibility, was a diminished figure in the courtroom. He maintained his arrogance to the end, his testimony a chilling manifesto of his twisted ideology. But the evidence was overwhelming. The ledger, Dr. Carter's testimony, the video from the warehouse, it all painted a picture of a man who was not a savior, but a monster. He was found guilty on multiple counts of murder, kidnapping, and racketeering, and sentenced to spend the rest of his life in a maximum security prison. For Sarah, the verdict was a hollow victory. She had won. She had exposed the truth and brought a monster to justice. Her story was the biggest of the decade, winning her a Pulitzer Prize and a level of recognition she had never dreamed of. But the cost had been immense. She was no longer the same hungry, idealistic journalist who had first stumbled upon a string of missing person cases. She had looked into the abyss, and the abyss had looked back at her. The shadows still clung to her. The faces of the victims still haunted her dreams. She left the Veritas Chronicle, unable to return to the daily grind of city reporting. She wrote a book about the investigation, a raw, unflinching account of her journey into the heart of darkness. It was her attempt to give a voice to the voiceless, to ensure that the forgotten victims of Alistair Vance would not be forgotten. Months after the trial, she received a letter in the mail. It was postmarked from the prison where Vance was incarcerated. Her first instinct was to burn it, to not let his poison touch her life again. But her journalistic curiosity got the better of her. She opened it. Contained a single sheet of paper. On it were 3 words, written in a familiar, elegant script. Still a busy bee. A cold shiver ran down her spine. He was locked away, his empire in ruins, but the game, for him, was not over. It was a final, chilling reminder that even when you cage the monster, the echoes of his evil can still haunt the world. Sarah folded the letter and put it away. She would not let him have the last word. Her work was not done. There were other monsters, other shadows, and other stories that needed to be told. And she would be the one to tell them. The fear was still there, a familiar companion, but now it was tempered with a steely resolve. She was a survivor, a truth-teller, and she would not be silenced.